Hello, everyone. We're back here after lunch. Welcome again to the Independent Game Summit. My name is Yon. I'm one of the advisory board members of the Independent Game Summit, and I have the pleasure to introduce you to Eric Johnson, who's going to be talking about knowing your market. Let's give him a big round of applause. I'll say one more quick thing. Real quick, make sure your phones are on silent, don't jiggle your badge too much, and make sure you fill out the evaluation. Thank you.
Thank you. So yes, knowing your market, making games that sell. Apparently this is a popular topic. Who knew people would be interested in paying their rent? I want to start by telling you a little bit about how I got into this topic. I'm a developer. I worked on a game called Life Goes On. And this is a puzzle platformer where you have to sacrifice your knights and use their dead bodies to solve puzzles. And so we released this on Steam in 2014, and then in 2016 we did a major content expansion and a release on the PlayStation 4. And during development, we had a lot of indicators that maybe we had a hit on our hands. We got media coverage, we won awards, we got on Steam back when that was a more difficult thing to do. But if you've heard this sort of story before, you know where this is going. Neither the initial release nor the 2016 follow-up ever really lived up to our expectations. And in trying to understand the sales performance, or the lack thereof, I've developed an interest in market analysis that borders on the obsessive. And so I've done lots of research to try to understand this stuff, the factors and what drives game sales, and I've learned a lot of things that I wish I had known before we started on Life Goes On. And because of all of this, I have developed a shocking amount of enthusiasm for data analysis and statistics. So I'm not saying that you should be looking at everything from the point of view of making money. And if you're making games to get rich, you are probably in the wrong industry. And there's also lots of non-commercial reasons to make games. But if you're planning on selling a game, you have to at least look at it from a business perspective to some extent and be aware of this stuff. So what causes games to sell? I want to present the argument that it's not just luck. It's not just how good the game is. It's not just your connections and who you know. It's not just your ability to promote and advertise and market your game. These are all super, super valuable factors, but they don't account for market fit, which I think is also something that is super, super important. And so a lot of what I'm talking about here is trying to figure out what people want, and particularly if enough people want what you're making to justify your making it. And this is something that we never really thought about it from this perspective when we were working on Life Goes On. We knew we had this sort of clever idea, we knew it was really cool to work with from a game design perspective, and we knew that people thought it was neat, but we never really gave a lot of thought towards whether this was something that people were gonna be really excited to actually buy. To give you some context, I'm talking about indie games on Steam and selling them. And what I'm going to say is going to get less applicable the further away from that you get. So free-to-play is different. The consoles have a different marketplace. Mobile is even more different. And factors like Steam Direct and the growth of the Chinese audience on Steam have really changed things in the last year, and things might be very different a year from now. So let's start with tools and techniques. How do you keep on top of this stuff? How do you know what has sold and what hasn't? Turns out there's loads of information readily available. And if you're interested in this stuff at all, you probably already know all about Steam Spy, which is a service that scrapes Steam and creates a statistical estimate of how many people have a game in their Steam library. Steam Spy is an absolutely fantastic resource, super, super useful, but you have to be aware that owners on Steam Spy are not the same thing as sales. There's lots of different ways a game can get into a user's library. You've got bundles, giveaways, free weekends, all sorts of stuff like this that can inflate the owner count. And also that accuracy is low for new games and games that don't have very many owners. Something that turns out to be surprisingly useful is the review system on the Steam store page itself. Particularly, it shows you a count of reviews by Steam purchasers versus other sources. And this gives you a lot of insight into how well a game is actually sold, on Steam at least. There's a technique called the Boxlighter method, where you can estimate the number of people who bought a game on Steam and played it by multiplying the reviews by 50. though some games might have a much higher or lower multiplier than that, so this is a pretty rough estimate. And in addition to Steam Spy and the review counts, you can get discount and bundle history from Is There Any Deal? You can get concurrent player history from Steam Charts. You can get regional price differences and loads of package details from SteamDB. Okay, let me talk about what I've learned from all of my obsessing. Have you heard this before? If your game didn't sell well, you just need to make a better game next time. Quality certainly does matter, but to think that game quality is the only factor or even the dominant factor in the game's success is the fallacy of believing that the world is fair and just, and this isn't always the case. In the context of Life Goes On, I want to say that it is far from a perfect game. There are many things that I wish we had done differently. There are 100 things that I wish I could change and improve on right now. But we did have some external indications that people might like it. And there was something that really came as a surprise to us, and that was that when we did the 2016 content expansion and PlayStation release, we significantly improved the quality level of the game, but we didn't see sort of a corresponding increase in sales or revenue. And this contradiction was one of the big factors motivating me to try to better understand the market. Okay, time to get into the numbers. I hope you like stats. I've done some rough revenue estimates for every non-free-to-play game on Steam. This is based on the Steam Spy data plus some additional data I've collected from Steam store pages. This estimate is rough, but I think for broad sort of trend analysis, it's very useful. Something to note, this doesn't include DLC or in-app purchases. This is estimating initial purchase revenue only. The revenue is shown on the y-axis here on this chart, and this is shown on a log scale. So points at the top of the graph have several orders of magnitude more revenue than the points at the bottom. And this chart in particular is comparing this revenue to Steam user score. So I've computed Spearman's Rho, which is a correlation measure that basically measures if X goes up, does Y also go up? And a 1.0 would indicate a perfect correspondence, whereas a 0 would say that we're looking at random noise. With a 0.31, this means that we're sort of looking at medium to low correlation. So, but we do have some correlation between user score and revenue. So hooray, there is some justice in the world. But this isn't a super strong correlation, but maybe we shouldn't be surprised by that. GTA 5 has a 68% positive user score. PUBG is only at 56% positive. These are incredibly popular games, but they have these somewhat unhappy player bases. And so while I'm very proud of Life Goes On's 96% positive, I really can't argue against PUBG's success. Let's look at a similar data set related to Metacritic score. This time we see a stronger correlation with a row of 0.44, which is getting into sort of medium to strong territory. And so we are seeing evidence that game quality does matter, both with player and critic reviews. So if you do make a better game, you will probably trend towards making more revenue. The next thing I want to talk about is genre. This is sort of the far out view of how viable different types of games are. Or should you make a puzzle platformer in 2018? The answer is no. So once upon a time, games like Fez, Braid, and Limbo sort of defined what indie success was. But the market has dramatically shifted since then. There have been really very few breakthrough puzzle platformer successes since about 2014. Inside and Never Alone are a couple of notable examples that I'm aware of, and these both have really incredible visuals, excellent marketing stories, and had, I think, fairly large production budgets. I did some genre analysis based on the Steam tag set. This is super, super noisy data, but I did some filtering and cleanup. And I've taken the median estimated revenue for puzzle platformers on Steam, and I've defined this as the metric standard unit of my disappointment with the games marketplace. So we're comparing it to other tags and genres here, and puzzle platformers are near the bottom. Action RPG has a median revenue 24 times the median puzzle platformer. There's some other indie favorites here, roguelike and Metroidvania, and they're only at 3.5 times the revenue of puzzle platformers. So I think we can see evidence that different genres have dramatically different market responses. So sometimes we get the impression that visuals might be less important for indie games. We have pixel art and low poly styles and that sort of thing. And it's not all about the cutting edge tech and the photorealistic visuals like you get in the AAA space. But I think visuals still matter a ton when someone's looking at a store page and deciding what to buy or what not to buy. I think there's no coincidence that my two examples of recent successful puzzle platformers both had incredible visuals. And we got a lot of positive comments about how Life Goes On looks, but we also got some criticisms about it looking generic. And so I think that visual quality isn't the only factor. There's also something to be said for distinctiveness. So are you showing something players unique or new? There's a master's thesis done by Michael Trinet, where he developed a machine learning model to predict success from Steam store pages. And he found that a screenshot's average saturation and distinct colors was one of the top factors in predicting success. Unfortunately, I've read his thesis, and it doesn't say either way whether having more colors and more saturation is good or bad, so I guess more research is needed there. An idea that I've encountered sort of from other indie developers is that the Steam audience wants dark and gritty games. So do we have any evidence for this? Valve has shared the top 100 games of 2017 by revenue on Steam. And when you look at this list, I would say that these games are pretty dark and gritty. There are some obvious exceptions to this. Rocket League and Cuphead are bright and cheerful, at least in appearance. But I think they also have a seriousness in their tone in some ways. They aren't goofy or silly games. And I think this is a factor that made it more difficult to sell Life Goes On. We have this really dark concept with sacrificing your characters, but we approached it in kind of a goofy, silly way. Let's look at the data. Here we see ESRB recommended age. And again, this is a log scale revenue estimate. And here we've got a row of 0.45. So this is about the same correlation that we saw with Metacritic score. So getting a higher Metacritic score seems to have about as much predictive power for success as getting a higher ESRB rating. And so this is comparing median revenue by ESRB rating, and this time we're looking at a linear scale because it's multiples of the median. And you can see that the median mature game has 36 times the revenue as the median E game on Steam. So Rocket League, Planet Coaster, Kerbal Space Program, these are all E-rated games, and they are some of the top-selling games on Steam. So it is possible to go against this trend, but sort of the typical E-rated game has comparatively little revenue. And when you consider that Steam is an online store, mostly driven by credit card purchases, it's a lot easier for adults to buy games than it is for kids. I wanted to look at this by tags, and again, comparing to puzzle platformers. And so Family Friendly has a median revenue of 0.84. So if you think puzzle platformers are in a tough spot, Family Friendly has it even worse. Crime, on the other hand, is at 23 times puzzle platformer. Somewhat less directly related tags like war and military are even higher. We can see colorful at 1.3 versus dark at 5.9. And if you need a more direct comparison than that, I'm not sure I have one, I'm sorry. I also want to note again to remember that this research is focused on Steam. The story for family-friendly games is probably very different on the Nintendo Switch. So a really big factor in commercial success is how long people play a game for. Is a game sticky? Is there a lot of content? Is it highly replayable? Is there multiplayer? Steam systems reward long play times. For example, I can't tell you how many times I've seen Steam pop up a window telling me my friend is playing Spelunky. And I think, maybe I should play Spelunky. If we look at average playtimes for some classics like Braid, Fez, and Limbo, and you compare these to more recent hits like Stardew Valley, RimWorld, Factorio, people are playing these newer games for 10 to 20 times as long as they played those older games. Sadly, Life Goes On's playtime is with the first groups, not the seconds. Okay, let's look at average playtimes plotted against revenue. This time, our X scale, which is the average playtime in minutes, is also on a log scale. So playtimes are increasing exponentially as we move to the right. With a rho of 0.55, this indicates a super strong correlation. This is the strongest correspondence that we've seen. So if you're looking at this chart, you are probably wondering what's up with that cluster, the strange vertical line that we see. And this sits at the 3 hour and 20 minute mark. And these games all have lots of players, but it looks like relatively few sales directly on Steam. So this is the same data, but this time the games in red are games that have Steam trading cards. So this shows evidence for the games that are created for exploiting the Steam trading card system, and this was a problem that Valve cracked down on about a year ago. So this is a super neat thing to see in the data, but don't let that vertical blob distract you from the really strong trend line going sort of up and to the right, where as revenue goes up, as playtimes go up, revenue goes up very directly. This rho value is really significant. And that's somewhat of a scary trend. You know, there's a lot of new games with ever more increasing games entering the market, while at the same time the most successful games are holding on to their players for a very long time. So we know that YouTube and Twitch are huge for marketing and for indie visibility, but not all games benefit equally from streaming. When a player watches your game, watches someone else play your game, do they say, oh, I have to play that for myself? Or do they come away from it thinking, I've seen enough, I've seen what this game is, I don't need to play it now? And I think that short narrative-heavy games and puzzle games that have consumable content might actually be hurt by streamers and Let's Plays. I can share some examples. PewDiePie is the #1 YouTube channel, and he played the extremely awesome Crypt of the Necrodancer. And this video has about 2.4 million views. Jacksepticeye played Life Goes On. Jack doesn't have quite as many followers, and his video sits at about 1.8 million views. But I think these are sort of ballpark comparable. Ryan Clark, Crypt of the Necrodancer's developer, shared that the PewDiePie video resulted in direct revenue for his game of about $60,000. Comparatively, Jack's video for Life Goes On, we saw a revenue bump of about $500. Another example comes from XGen Studios. YouTuber Matt Shea did 6 episodes on their game Super Motherload. XGen estimates this drove about $10,000 to $15,000 in revenue for them. The same YouTuber played their new point-and-click adventure game, The Low Road. They saw 0 results. So Crypt of the Necrodancer and Super Motherload both feature procedural generation. They're both highly replayable games, whereas Life Goes On and The Low Road are far less replayable. So next thing I want to talk about is community. Can a community get involved in your game? Do you have level editors? Do you have mod support? Do you have leaderboards? Is there multiplayer so that players can drag their friends into the game to play with them? Life Goes On has none of these things. You may be noticing a trend here. Looking at this question in the tag data, we see some of the top tags that I found. Moddable sits at almost 140 times the median revenue of puzzle platformers. This is a bit of an outlier, but I think it is indicative of the trend. Level Editor doesn't look great in this chart, but it's still double the median puzzle platformer. You also have to be careful though. At 0.43, 4-player local is one of the lowest revenue tags I looked at on Steam. Game designers seem to really love to make 4-player local games, but it seems like they're really hard to sell on Steam. So the factors that I just reviewed aren't the only contributors to market fit. These are just the ones that I could show you good data for. And I'm not saying that it's impossible to buck these trends. If you want to make your own short, colorful, family-friendly puzzle platformer, please feel free. But you will be fighting an uphill battle. And there are lots of super successful games that don't match these trends. So if you're going to try to defy them, though, be aware of what you're doing and approach it thoughtfully. So you might think that I'm just looking at the top sellers list and just chasing the hits and chasing the big bucks. And that's not what indie games are about. That indie games should be targeting a niche, finding an audience that really loves what you're doing and going after that audience. And so yes, finding a niche is absolutely important. But buys indie games on Steam turns out to be a surprisingly narrow niche to begin with. There's an article titled "Your Target Audience Doesn't Exist" by Sergey Galyonkin, the creator of Steam Spy, where he estimates only about 1% of Steam's user base regularly buys new games every year. So you have to make sure your niche is viable. And if you can tell me that there's this target audience out there that really wants more puzzle platformers, and you know how to reach them, please come talk to me. I have a game, I would love to sell them. To give an example of a narrowly targeted but viable niche, let's consider Zachtronics games. These are basically engineering challenges for programmers, which seems about as niche as it gets. They recently launched their new game, Opus Magnum, and I saw it near the top of the global top sellers list on Steam. That's a good sign that a niche is viable. And it turns out that the medium programming tag game is almost 11 times as successful as our standard puzzle platformer. So yeah, programming seems like a little bit more viable despite its very niche appeal. I'm also not saying that you should not be looking at the top selling games and trying to clone them. Again, if you're just making games to make money, go do something else. It will be easier. Most designers have a lot of different ideas. So when you're choosing between your ideas, evaluate them for market fit. Look at the factors that correlate with success and make something unique based on that. For example, are you targeting a genre that's in demand? Or if you're breaking new ground, does your design at least align with the trends for success? Like, remember the strength of correlation between success and playtimes. Will people want to play your game for a long time? What would it take to make long playtimes part of your design? Also, can you find games that are doing similar things to what you're doing? Can you explain the successes? Can you explain the failures? Do you think these games that you're looking at had comparable marketing and development budgets to yours? To give you a bit of an epilogue for Life Goes On, we've continued to put a lot of hard work into the game. We've continued to support it. Localization has been really big for us, particularly in Asia. We got kind of lucky. We didn't have a lot of text, and so localization turned out to be cheap. We'll probably never really get our investment back out of it, but we've done much better than we expected to based on our launch, even though it's been a bit of an uphill battle. If you want to learn more about this, Ryan Clark, the Crypt of the Necrodancer developer, used to run a regular Twitch stream where he would do market analysis for a couple of hours. Unfortunately, he's no longer regularly streaming, but you can find back episodes on YouTube, and they are definitely worth your time. Lars Doucette, the developer of Defender's Quest, has a project called Steam Profit, which looks at upcoming Steam releases and tries to pick which games will be successful, which is a very useful approach to try to test your understanding of the marketplace. And you can also watch Total Biscuit's Co-optional podcast. This features popular streamers, and a regular segment is where they look at upcoming games on Steam, and you can just sort of see their reaction to their trailers, their concepts, their screenshots, and see what they think of them. This can be very informative. So, thank you for your time. If you want to talk about this stuff, hit me up on Twitter, Eric E. Johnson, Eric with a K. If you want help, if you want to talk, if you want just to nerd out about stats, I would love to. Please reach out to me. And I think we have some time for some questions. Two or three? Yeah, sounds like we have time for 2 or 3 questions. If you could line up at the mics on either side. And you look like you're there first, so please go ahead.
Yeah, quick question. Hi, I'm Dave from No One Cares. You mentioned that replayability was an indicator of revenue,
Yes.
possibly correlated. But then you also mentioned that roguelike is like way down as far as tag goes, which is interesting. Do you have any sort of insight on that?
Roguelike isn't popular with AAA. And roguelike is a pretty broadly applied tag as well. And so I think I would say that it would be a big driver there. On the left.
The 2 categories which seem to rank the lowest in the data you collected are puzzle platformers and rated E for everybody. Could that possibly just be a result of how many games fit those categories? Like puzzle platformer is something you could bang out in an hour, whereas a action RPG or a mature game is not likely, most indie games are E for everyone, right?
Yeah, so I would say that there is certainly an element of not just do people want these things, but also how saturated are these areas, how many people are already filling that need, and how easy is it to, yeah, there are people who love puzzle platformers, but they are drowning in selection. versus, you know, the people who want the top-end AAA crime action. You know, it's harder to meet their needs. So I think that is certainly a big factor. All right. Oh, yeah.
Hi. Do you have any tools or tips on how to counter survivorship bias and find the games that are not successful?
How do you counter survivorship bias and find the games that are unsuccessful? So I mentioned Steam Profit, and playing Steam Profit is the process of looking at basically every new game that is coming out on Steam every week, and you will very, very, very quickly find innumerable examples of games that don't succeed, that don't generate revenue. And I found, looking at all of these games, that there would be many games that I thought, you know, maybe they won't be the next hugest hit, but certainly they will see some reasonable amount of revenue. And it turns out that, you know, their revenue is within margin of error of 0. Wow. So yeah, I would say just looking at the game store will very, very, very rapidly dissuade you of the survivorship bias. One more, I think.
Sure.
Yes.
Do you have you done, and are they existing somewhere? And if they are, will you post them somewhere? Have you done time and money adjusted comparisons, like take into account how development costs and price point for selling it?
Yeah. So there's no public data set on development budgets. You might be able to do some interesting data based on, like you say, price point. Higher price games probably were more expensive to develop. Something that you will certainly see as a trend on Steam is that games below $10 very rarely have any sort of significant revenue. And yeah, so.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I think we're done.